Now what I want to do is share with you a kind of book review. This is from Campus Reform, and it's written by Maria Copeland. This has to do with a book called White Fragility, which is on the top of the bestseller lists. This has been propelled there because of the death of George Floyd and everybody's concern about race and racism. And it's a legitimate concern, and we all should be concerned about this. But the woman who wrote this book, I think, is going in exactly the wrong direction, as you'll understand in a minute. So, in essence, Campus Reform says, we read this book so you don't have to. The angle, they say, that sets this book apart from similar books is likely its development of white fragility as the catalyst of all racial conflict. White fragility, according to the author, is a phenomenon that occurs when people of color confront white people on race-related issues. Categorically, white people will react with a range of defensive responses, which include, quote, emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and withdrawal from stress-inducing situations, which, quote, work to reinstate white equilibrium as they repel the challenge, return our racial comfort, and maintain our dominance within the racial hierarchy. Now, the reason she's saying our is because the author, what is her name? Robin DiAngelo, that she herself is white. So this is a self-indictment. But what you'll notice is she says that the reaction of people who are white on this is a range of different things. So she talks about people who get defensive, they argue against it. Some people say they have fear, they display guilt, they go silent, they avoid confrontation. So no matter what the white person does, it's an example, she says, of white supremacy and white fragility. In other words, it doesn't matter whether you try to rationally argue about this or you try to reason your way through it or if you grow silent or whatever. No matter what you do, you are, in her world, somehow demonstrating white fragility. This behavior, the author says, is born of superiority and entitlement. White fragility, she says, is not weakness per se. In fact, it's a powerful means of white racial control and the protection of white advantage. Essentially, she argues that white people's distaste for racial confrontation is responsible for perpetuating white supremacy. She recognizes that white people do not like to be classified at large under a broad category, and she predicts throughout the text that white readers will reject her arguments because of this sensitivity, which is a tendency that they must simply learn to overcome. And as you'll see in a minute, it doesn't matter whether you overcome it or not, you're still guilty. So you see what's happening here. No matter how you respond to it, whether you agree with it and say, yeah, you know, I'm really sorry, yeah, white privilege, or you disagree with that and say, that's not true, I'm not a racist. She says, either way, it's a self-fulfilling thing. You're just simply demonstrating your propensity for white privilege and white supremacy. So this is a fault. It's faulty logic at the outset because it's assuming the conclusion in the premise. And she frames it in such a way that there's no way that you can actually argue against it without, aha, look, see, that's what white supremacists do. Doesn't matter what you say. She has that all programmed into her thesis here so that anything that you might say or do or not do, if you refrain to comment on it, that's just simply further proof, in her world, that you are doing this. She makes a case that racism is deeply embedded in the fabric of our society, saying that all racist acts stem from institutional racism. This means that, quote, listen to this, only whites can be racist because in the United States, only whites have the collective social and institutional power and privilege over people of color, end of quote. She acknowledges the occurrence of individual racist acts, but says such actions are, quote, part of a larger system of interlocking dynamics. Consequently, according to her standards, racism is a behavior unique to white people that cannot be demonstrated by people of color. That, by the way, is the essence of racism, to take a whole group of people who, based on their skin color, the argument goes, are guilty of some particular thing that they have no control over simply because of their skin color. This is no different from those people who hatefully say, some still say, but it was not at all unpopular to say this, say 100 years ago, that black people were inferior mentally simply because of their black skin. Ridiculous, absurd. And it was taking a whole group of people and classifying them in some way simply because of their skin color. In other words, Robin DiAngelo is peddling racism. She's actually purveying racism with these hateful stereotypes. She says, and this is not a quote, but this is a reference to her book, not only have all white people demonstrated racism, they are doomed to do so indefinitely. She suggests that there is no way for white people to grow up without being racist because white parents cannot raise their children in such a way that they do not benefit from and perpetuate racism in America. Not only that, but white parents cannot teach their children not to be racially prejudiced, and if they train their children not to express racism verbally, they are only teaching censorship. You see how this works? There's nothing you can do. If you're white, sorry, you're a racist. But I'm not a racist. Nope, sorry. And the very fact that you say you're not a racist proves that you're a racist. Continuing. The author suggests race always influences a situation, so there is nothing coincidental about the color of someone's skin and any conflict in which they are involved. Here's a quote from the book. On some level, race is always at play, even in its supposed absence. And here she redefines what she believes white supremacy to be. White supremacy, she says, this is a quote, describes the culture we live in, a culture that positions white people and all that is associated with them, whiteness, as ideal. White supremacy is more than the idea that whites are superior to people of color. It is the deeper premise that supports this idea. The definition of whites as the norm or standard for human and people of color as a deviation from that norm. So that's the end of the quote. The review continues. Under this description, which neglects to acknowledge the impact of its traditional connotations, such as ties to the KKK, all white behavior can be categorized as not only racist, but also as white supremacist. This is what she's saying. Now, a few other quick tidbits here. She says in the book, white is a false identity, an identity of false superiority. In that sense, whiteness isn't real. The dream is, quote, the perfect world, end quote, unpolluted by blacks. Now, these are her words. Please understand me. She's saying this, and if you're white, she's indicting you under this rubric. She says, if whites are to construct this world, blacks must be separated through state violence. Yet they still must exist, for the existence of blacks provides the needed other against which whites may rise. This is ludicrous and hateful and racist itself. She says, thus, white identity depends in particular on the projection of inferiority onto blacks and the oppression this inferior status justifies for the white collective. The book's primary points distilled are the following. Number one, white people must acknowledge the grim consequences of their actions, although they are far too frail to do so. White people, number two, are responsible to repair the system in which racism runs rampant, although nothing they can do will ever be enough. Number three, white guilt is unhelpful because it does not advance any real change, although white people must reflect seriously on the extent of what they have done. I interpret that to mean you should feel guilty, but don't express it, because if you express guilt, that's just simply showing your white supremacy, but you better feel guilty, just don't express it. And lastly, white people should be appalled at what they have brought about, although white women's tears only exacerbate the situation and reinforce white privilege. So I have a question that arose in my mind after I read this analysis of the book. Does this mean that if you are white and you vote for, let's say, a black candidate, so Barack Obama, who was elected president, if you elect a black president, you're a racist. If you don't vote to elect a black president, you're a racist. If you patronize and like and maybe are a fan for a sport in which black people predominate, you're a racist. If you don't pay attention to it because you don't like it, you're a racist. Everything you do is racism. So take a look at this. Kaylin just posted a link to this review. It's from Campus Reform. We appreciate their diligence on this issue. And I offer it to you for your consideration. And you tell me if you think that the author of that article is on target.
For more of The Patrick Madrid Show, visit relevantradio.com/Patrick.